Good morning.
Good morning.
The blessing of the Lord be upon you.
We bless you in the name of the Lord.
Thank you. We are studying the Intertestamental Period of history. I want to just make sure that I put my phone on Do Not Disturb. And we are on lesson 18. I said last week we were 16, but that was actually 17. We're going to go back just as briefly as I can. Look at what we were talking about. There's where we have been. Here's where we are. The Hasmonean Rulers. Last week we talked about John Hyrcanus, one of the most important of the Hasmonean rulers. One of the things that I wanted to emphasize is that he was a ruler. He acted like a king, but he refused to be called a king. But what he did, he conquered Samaria to the north. Now this is a later map. This is at the time of Jesus. So this little area of Judea here was what he, as high priest, had become ruler over. Again, he refused to be called a king under the greater elements that were in power at that time. But he takes Samaria, this area here, and we understand the difference between Judea and Samaria at the time of Jesus. The Samaritans were not well liked. Judeans were not liked by Samaritans. But these were a people who had been transplanted here by Assyrians. They were very, we'll say, ecumenical. They had all kinds of religions going on, plus Judaism or Yahweh worship. They had their own temple here at Mount Gerizim. We've talked about some of the struggles that were going on about because of that. He also took Idumea to the south. We don't have Idumea on this, but it's in this area down here. And they were from the Edomites who had lived in this area. At the destruction of Edom, there were several of them that moved into this area. So he conquers this territory and forces them to worship Yahweh. They begin coming into these areas and up into Galilee. And that's going to be important for our discussions coming later on. So they forced the Idumeans to convert to Judaism. And we talk about that being the first instance of forced the Jews forcing people to become Jews. Always before it was voluntary. You can come, you can be a part of us. You have to accept it, you have to want to do it. And that gave rise to Herod eventually being appointed king by Rome, because Herod was an Idumean. His family was from Idumea. They were forced to become Jews or to worship Yahweh, accept the law of Moses, and that brings them into certain political positions within Judea. But under John Hyrcanus, Pharisees and Sadducees develop into major political parties. So we talked about that last week. But it's the last, his reign was the last under which Judea was a powerful united state. So this is where we take up today. Aristobulus I succeeded him as high priest, succeeded John Hyrcanus. John Hyrcanus was his father. He reigned from 104 to 103, so he only had like a year to 2 years of reigning as high priest. He was the first Jew in nearly 500 years to establish a monarchy. In other words, to actually claim to be king. He was the first Hebrew to claim both the high priesthood and the kingship, because we know from the law of Moses, descendants of Aaron were the priests and high priests. Descendants of David were the kings. Now the Pharisees, strictly going by the law, were concerned about his kingship because they held that only descendants of David could be a king. The Sadducees weren't concerned about it all because they subscribed to a liberal political affiliations. Whatever goes goes. You know, we can have power by dealing with making alliances with Seleucids, Grecians, Egyptians, now Romans. That's how they would gain power, not by what the people wanted, what their own citizens wanted, but by the powerful peoples around them. And of course we understand that the Bible, as we look back at it, what God had desired for his people, God to be in leadership and the people to desire leaders that would follow the law of Moses. So you have there the Pharisees. They didn't want a king that wasn't from David. The Sadducees didn't care. Then now you have another group that's coming into focus. The Essenes generally avoided direct political involvement. Now I mention the Essenes because they're kind of a group that just says, hey, we're going to leave politics alone. We're just going to go out here and we are going to worship Yahweh, the Lord, to the very best of our ability. We are going to strive for personal righteousness, and we're going to pull out of society if we need. Some of them actually had monasteries where they would work, and it is quite possible, probably most likely, that this is where John the Immerser was raised. That his father and mother were very old when John was born. We know that from scriptures. That they died, he becomes an orphan. Somebody needs to take care of him. It was the Essenes that took care of him and raised him, and he got this training, and that's why, you know, he didn't go to the temple. He was a priest, but he shunned the temple, and he didn't want involved in the political process. Why did he get in trouble with Herod? For promoting personal righteousness. You're not allowed to have your brother's wife. You know, it's wrong. So that gives us an indication. Here's where those things are beginning. Their focus was primarily on spiritual and religious matters. Their leader was called the teacher of righteousness. And if you go back into their writings, the writings of the Essenes, which primarily are found in the Dead Sea Scrolls, you'll learn about this teacher of righteousness. He was likely a legitimate heir to the high priesthood. That he should have, you know, he was an heir. Not that he should have been the high priest, but he could have been the high priest because he was a descendant of Aaron. Many suspect it was a man by the name of Onias Ha-Mi-Agal. Onias Ha-Mi-Agal. Now, despite their opposition, Aristobulus managed to hold both titles during his brief reign. And what he did, now, we talked about how his father had taken certain areas. What he does, he takes Galilee and he forces Judaism on the citizens of Galilee. Why is Galilee important? Where was Jesus from? Galilee. In fact, one of the complaints, how could Jesus be the Messiah? Does anything good come out of Galilee, out of that area? Well, that's this area. And again, they were very highly Hellenized, we will say. But again, they're forced into Judaism, and they have to take away all their idols, their places of worship to these other gods, which, it's a good thing. But Aristobulus, as he's doing this, he's not necessarily doing it for Judaism, he's doing it for his own power. He conquered the Etereans of Lebanon. Now, Lebanon was on up. See, here's Iterea up here. And this area would be Lebanon in that time. And again, that's just a place where a lot of Jews were living, but it was very Grecian. And he takes that area, he conquers it, and forces them to convert to Judaism. Then the Etereans, like Herod the Great, and not so much Herod the Great, but we'll say his father, Antipater, and we'll have a little section on Antipater later, and how the Herods then gained power. The Etereans in Judea, now not only do they have to accept the law of Moses and become Jews, they have to be circumcised. Now, we've talked about that before. The men have to be circumcised, and that's something that couldn't be very pleasant for them. We'll put it that way. So Aristobulus' acts are recorded in Josephus's War of the Jews and Antiquities of the Jews. And that's where we would get most of this information. But notice what? Maybe 2 years of his reign. But you see what they're doing? They're expanding the territory of Judea. Now we come to the next high priest, and that's Alexander Jannaeus. On Aristobulus' death, his brother Alexander Jannaeus was released from prison and made king. Remember that there was a high priest that died. There was a fight for the high priesthood, and a couple people were put in prison, and one was poisoned or whatever, and it's a bad deal. But the one that survived actually becomes high priest. And since his brother had claimed to be king, the people make him king. King and high priest, Hasmonean dynasty. He married his brother's widow, Queen Salome, or Salome, Alexandra. He extended the territory of Judea to the extent of the kingdom during David's reign. So if you go back and you look when David was reigning. When David reigned, the extent of the kingdom was the extent to what God had promised the children of Israel when they come out of Egypt. The premillennialists who teach that, well, Israel didn't get all the territory they were supposed to, so Jesus has to come back and to a temple in Jerusalem and be king, and then extend the territory of Israel to what God promised. They miss all the parts of the Bible that say everything that God had promised them was given to them. So they just ignore it because of their theories, we might even say their creeds. So his entire, he took most of Palestine's Mediterranean coastline, that's in this area, which deals with where the Philistines were, up here, Tyre and Sidon and all this, and, make sure I get it right here, regions around the Jordan River, up in through here. That's why when Jesus is doing his ministry, it's easy for the Jews to cross over here, come up through this area, and then come back over, say, to Nazareth and Capernaum and those areas, and avoid Samaria, because this is under the rule of the Herods at the time of Jesus. That's why it's important for this to be in this section. That's setting the political and geographical tone for what's happening. So his entire 27-year reign was spent fighting against regional enemies. And despite this, despite him taking control of Galilee in that area, the region of Galilee grew commercially. There was a lot of business, commerce going on in this area then. It becomes very profitable. Why? You wouldn't think that it would. Could it possibly be that God's hand was in it to make it a place where the Christ could come, be born in Bethlehem, but be raised there, away from the political conflicts that would be in Jerusalem and Judea, that his life would be spared there? It's something to think about. Now, Alexander's rule, down here on point 3, was characterized by cruelty and oppressive measures against his subjects. He was a ruthless tyrant who persecuted early Pharisees. He was a Sadducee, and that's what I say, even though he was gaining this territory, forcing Judaism upon all these peoples, forcing the Idumeans in Judea to be circumcised. He's persecuting Pharisees, the ones who were strict with the law. When some of the Jews threw fruit at him, you know how in movies and stuff, and it used to be the old-time thing. If you didn't like the performer or the speaker, you threw fruit at them, throw a tomato at them or whatever. Well, some people did that. He put 6,000 people to death for it, probably Pharisees. He had 50,000 Jews killed in civil wars in 6 years. His own people. The Jews eventually received help from Eucerus. I think that's, what is that, good skin? Eucerin. Is there? Yeah. In Greek, I think it's something like good skin, something like that, or something good for the skin. Alexander, they get help from Eucerus of Damascus. Is Damascus on there? Yeah, here's Damascus. And he comes down, he helps the people of Judea, the Jews, and primarily the Pharisees. Alexander was forced to flee to the mountains. He captured 800 of the most prominent Jews. And when we say 800 of the most prominent Jews, probably Pharisees, and probably people who were of political prominence, like priesthood, that would be against him. He brought them to Jerusalem, where he had them crucified. While they were on their crosses, dying, he ordered the throats of their wives and children cut before their eyes, while he and his concubines feasted. And I think the implication of that, what that implies is, they were feasting while they were watching these men crucified and watching the wives and children's throats being cut. They were having a feast and watching it all like it was some great Grecian play. Well, Alexander Jannaeus died at the age of 49 in Ragaba beyond the Jordan River. And what happened to him? His drunkenness and dissipation led to a bout of fever and chills. His, I guess, guilt finally caught up with him. All right, one more little section, and then we'll get into the major turning point toward the Romans. And we talked about this Queen Salome, Alexandria. Remember how it said that she had married Alexander, was it Alexander Jannaeus? Yeah. On Aristobulus' death, his brother Alexander Jannaeus was released from prison, and he married Queen Salome Alexandria. So she is only one of 3 women to rule over Judea. If you go back into the Old Testament, there were just a couple times in biblical history where there was a queen who ruled because the husband died and the next one in line typically was too young to rule. So you could look back at those historical accounts. She was the last regnant queen of Judea and the final ruler of an independent Jewish nation. So, they were basically independent with these Hasmoneans, even though there was a lot of control from the outside. But this is going to be the end of it. She married Aristobulus I and then later Alexander Jannaeus. During Alexander's reign, she had limited political influence. She played a role in arranging the assassination of her brother-in-law, Antigonus, and we've talked about that, when we discussed Antigonus. And she tried, but couldn't prevent the persecution of the Pharisees by her husband. In other words, hey, don't antagonize the Pharisees. Don't persecute them. Placate them a little bit. Well, Alexander entrusted her at the time of his death. Remember, he goes to Ragaba, right? And he gets sick, and he's about to die. He's high priest and king. The people have made him king. He just didn't appoint himself. But he entrusts her with governing advice on his deathbed. She was to conceal his death from his soldiers. They were to march victoriously into Jerusalem, but then the Pharisees, and then give the Pharisees complete control. Okay? In other words, we won, but then give the Pharisees complete control. She would then turn his body over to the men of Jerusalem to do as they wished. Now, what do you think they should do with the body of this guy who had killed so many and caused so much civil war? Here's what they did. The Jews and Pharisees were appeased just because they gave, she said, we're victorious, we've won, now Pharisees get to be in control, so they give Alexandra Jannaeus a state funeral. And they bury him with the respected leaders of the Jews, and like the king's cemetery. Now that's something, that's...
Had to go one way or the other. No in between for that.
Right. But what happens? Salome, Alexandra, remained queen and ruled Judea for 9 years. She appointed her son, Hyrcanus II, as high priest. She appointed another son, Aristobulus II, to oversee the army. And that is where we, next, Lord willing, next Lord's Day, we will take up, as we see the spiraling down of Judea into Roman and Herodian rule. Look at the date. Hyrcanus II and Aristobulus II from 76. But Hyrcanus II doesn't become king until 67 because his mother is ruling. She's got those 9 years. But look at the end date. 63 BC is when the Romans take Jerusalem and Judea under Pompey. That's where we'll be headed for next week. Do you have any questions?
We're almost there.
Oh, getting there, but understanding more of the intrigue and the interconnections of, wow, what was going on when Jesus was born and in Jesus' lifetime, and bringing about Jesus' death. All these things were set up by things that were going on, events that were happening at this time. So we'll stop there, as we
Things
should.
that he would have had to contend with. Just looking at 100 years about until his ministry. So the repercussions. Okay, look what we deal with today, and then look back 100 years.
Right. And if you look at this, all right, 67 BC, okay, is when Queen Salome, Alexandra, dies. Add 33 years to that, you've got 100. And now you're talking about 3 years after the death of Jesus is when the Gentiles come into the kingdom. When Cornelius is converted. There's a lot going on in those time periods. And Cornelius was a Roman centurion. Again, Thank you for your time and attention.
Thank you for